the contradictions missionaries had like in their historical situation inside colonialism. Hi, my name is Zoe, and I study global history at the Free University of Berlin. I have quite a share of history already working in fields related to global history, especially German colonial history and the history of Christian missions. I once did an internship with a foundation called the Archive and Museum Foundation of the United Evangelical Mission in Wuppertal. Yeah, they have a museum where they have exhibits from all around the world that missionaries brought to Germany. And yeah, as the name suggests, it's a foundation that's basically managing the archive of different historical missionary agencies. Basically, these two missionary agencies, the Rhenish Missionary Society and the Bethel Mission Society. And the Rhenish Missionary Society was very active in German Southwest Africa, to modern-day Namibia, but not limited to that. It was a global missionary agency. It was not limited to German colonies. It existed long before, and it was also active, for example, in Indonesia. Mission agencies are like a very central part of colonial history, even if it, like in the case of the Rhenish Mission Agency, it was like there way before colonialism came up as something, or even existing far beyond the immediate colonialism. So my tasks were very distributed across all the different branches of the foundation, basically. In terms of my work in the archive, there was a lot of basically being familiar with the files, taking out files for researchers that were coming in. For example, every intern there is also required to transcribe a CV of a missionary, basically. So when these missionaries came into the organization and were like trained and then sent abroad, when they were accepted and sent abroad, they all wrote their life stories basically into a huge book. So, and that's basically a tradition. Every intern will transcribe one of those life stories, basically, which can be quite challenging or can be very easy depending on the missionary's handwriting. Yeah, but I also like worked in, of course, in the museum, which was very interesting. There was, we were actually preparing for an exhibition, so it was basically my job to categorize a lot of the exhibits that were going in there. And also it was my task to actually write a text that would be displayed next to those objects in the exhibition. I was quite aware of the contradictions missionaries had like in their historical situation inside colonialism, and being in this place and examining the archive and the museum. These contradictions really exemplified themselves even more. They became a lot more visible. So on the one side, of course, there's the crimes missionaries were complicit in. In case of the Rhenish Mission Agency, they were very complicit in the genocide of the Herero and Nama people. But also, their missionaries were often also very critical of colonialism, and so you don't really have a clear picture of good versus bad. It's really quite it really quite depends a lot of times on the individual, and yeah, even in a systemic way, it's often really unclear whether the work missions did was really extremely bad and aiding colonialism, or being a counterweight to like colonial administrations in those places. And so it's often the case that both is happening at the same time. And I think that makes mission history like a very interesting thing to study. You know, these agencies also have this history that continues until today in many cases. And if you read their magazines, basically, they're very engaged in like anti-racism and these kinds of things. Also have transitioned their work from this very one-directional sending missionaries to a place to proselytize people, to very decentralized and with independent structures, with churches in different countries. But of course, you know, colonialism still continues to this day in a certain sense, that the archive and the museum still understand themselves as like preserving the history of the mission agency for everyone around the world. So if you're in Tanzania and you're interested in the history of your church, basically you'd have to go to Wuppertal to actually like see it and visit the archive and everything like that. So I mean, it's this general problem that's also coming up with the British Museum, for example, where they want to present themselves as this neutral institution that's just preserving, but ignore the power imbalance of the people whose ancestors' belongings are stored there, that have to travel even though they're economically disadvantaged from the get-go. I mean, with the mission, it's not that bad in a sense, because there are these, of course, these funding programs, and of course they have the email of the archivist, and so there's a lot of communication. The archive gets a lot of requests from all over the world, from their partner churches, to look things up. Still, like there are these underlying problems with it. So difficult and nuanced situation. When I first entered the museum with the curator together, he was basically showing me around, and so by walking around, something caught my eye immediately, because it's this very big kind of statue. It's like a wooden structure with like cow horns attached to it. And I asked him about it, because it's like easily the most prominent exhibit in the museum. I asked him about its history. And he told me this very interesting story about how they don't exactly know how it found its way to Wuppertal. They're very sure that it's from Namibia, and it was probably brought by a missionary at some point in the late 19th, early 20th century, but they don't really know exactly how it got there, because all the inventory catalogs got destroyed during World War II. That's a problem, and all they basically have is a photograph from an exhibition in the early 20th century where this object can be seen. And they were trying to figure out where it's actually from, and because they have none of their own files to go after, they tried oral history investigations in Namibia itself to find out where this particular artifact is from. Now, the interesting thing is, we know that it's probably some sort of gravestone or monument to a leader that had passed away, and with its prominence, one might think there must be something to go after, some stories about how it was stolen. But even the oral history investigation found no trace of it. That's basically the status quo. There is this very surely stolen or illegally acquired monument there that should or probably has a lot of significance for the ancestors of the person this artifact commemorates, but nobody can find out where it's actually from to return it or start talks or whatever. I don't think so, and I don't think that would actually be like a possibility. The thing is that it's always difficult for a state to claim possessions over certain objects of colonial provenance. In my opinion, and I think this is kind of the official consensus, it's always important that the actual descendants or of the original owners have the power to decide what happens to those objects. In the case of Namibia, it would be kind of even more problematic because the state of Namibia does have a history of kind of ignoring these concerns of groups that were affected by colonialism and ignoring their input. The most recent example of this is discussion about reparations for the genocide. Germany and Namibia essentially came to an agreement on Germany paying reparations for it, but the whole process, the people affected from it, most notably the Overherero, were very absent from the whole process, and when the agreement was reached, were vehemently against it. So if we would just take this object and give it to Namibia and they'd put it in a museum in Windhoek or wherever, this would, first of all, problematic that the descendants of people affected, the commemorated person, would get no say in it. And second of all, even if we would later find out who it actually belongs to, they would not really have the power to demand it back from the Namibian government, for example. The Namibian government is not known for listening to the people affected by German colonialism directly, and it's a huge problem inside Namibia. This proposition basically would have some ethical concerns about it, like from the perspective of descendants of German colonizers who are trying to return it to whom it actually belongs. From what I heard, the museum or the foundation is very interested in finding out where this object is actually from and maybe even returning it.